Thank you for clicking in this video. Do you believe in the unexplained? In legends that come to life on a dark, deserted road, or in the chilling depths of a snowstorm? Tonight, we explore two tales where ordinary moments turn into unimaginable nightmares. But be warned, these stories will make you question what's real and what's lurking in the shadows. Will they survive? Stay with us to uncover the terrifying truth.
The woman on the road. We were just a group of friends, driving back from a party that had gone later than expected. The night was thick with fog, the kind that swallows the world whole, leaving nothing but the faint outline of the road ahead. I was at the wheel, my knuckles tight on the steering wheel, trying to stay focused as the alcohol from earlier buzzed faintly in the back of my mind. The others, Mike, Jason, and Lisa, were in various stages of drunken exhaustion, their laughter and chatter having died down to a quiet murmur. The clock on the dashboard read 2:43 a.m., and we were somewhere along Route 27, a stretch of highway notorious for being desolate at this hour. The occasional lonely farmhouse or distant glow of a small town was all that interrupted the oppressive darkness that pressed against the windows. We were talking about how quiet the road was when we saw her, a woman standing by the roadside, dressed in white. Her hair was long and dark, clinging to her pale skin as if wet. She raised a hand, signaling for us to stop. There was something about her that made my stomach tighten with unease, but it was too late to drive past her. Jason, ever the impulsive one, leaned forward from the back seat and said, "Dude, stop the car. We can't just leave her out here." I slowed down and pulled over, the tires crunching against the gravel on the shoulder. She walked toward the car, and as she got closer, I could see her face clearly in the headlights. She was beautiful, but there was something off about her, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Her eyes were wide, almost too wide, and her lips were pale, almost bloodless. Mike rolled down the window and asked, "Need a ride?" She nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on something just beyond us, as if she was looking through us rather than at us. "Yes," she said, her voice soft and distant, "I need to get home." Lisa, who had been half asleep, perked up. "Where do you live?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. The woman hesitated before answering. "Not far from here. Just down the road." There was a strange silence that followed her words, a pause that seemed to stretch on forever. I could feel the tension in the car, the unease that we were all trying to ignore. But Jason, always eager to play the hero, was already pushing the passenger seat forward to let her in. "Come on in," he said with a smile. "We'll take you wherever you need to go." The woman slid into the back seat next to Lisa, who shifted uncomfortably as if sensing something wasn't right. As soon as the door closed, the temperature in the car seemed to drop, and a shiver ran down my spine. I glanced at the rearview mirror, and for a moment, I thought I saw her lips curl into a faint smile, but when I blinked, it was gone. I pulled back onto the road, the silence in the car now thick and oppressive. No one spoke, and I kept my eyes on the road, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in my gut. The fog had grown thicker, swallowing the world outside, and I had to slow down to a crawl just to see where I was going. After what felt like an eternity, the woman finally spoke. "You can drop me off at the cemetery," she said, her voice almost a whisper. My heart skipped a beat. "The cemetery?" I echoed, not sure I'd heard her right. "Yes," she replied, her tone flat and emotionless. "It's just up ahead." I exchanged a quick glance with Mike, who raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. The others remained silent, and I could feel the tension in the car rising with each passing second. There was something deeply unsettling about the way she had said it, as if the words themselves carried a weight that was pulling us down into something dark and cold. As we neared the cemetery, the fog seemed to part, revealing the iron gates that loomed ahead. I pulled up to the entrance, the headlights casting long shadows across the tombstones beyond. The woman opened the door and stepped out, her white dress billowing in the night air. She turned back to look at us, her eyes meeting mine in the rearview mirror. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely audible. And then she was gone, disappearing into the darkness of the cemetery. For a moment, none of us moved. The air in the car was thick with something I couldn't quite place, fear, maybe, or something worse. It wasn't until Lisa broke the silence that we realized just how wrong everything had gone. "She's not there," Lisa whispered, her voice trembling. "What do you mean?" Jason asked, turning to look out the window. "She's gone," Lisa repeated, her eyes wide with fear. "She just disappeared." A cold dread washed over me as I looked out into the cemetery, but there was no sign of her. The only sound was the wind rustling through the trees, and the oppressive silence that followed. That's when I heard it, the faintest whisper, carried on the breeze, like a voice calling from far away. "You should never have stopped." I froze, my blood turning to ice as the whisper echoed in my mind. I looked at the others, and from their faces, I knew they had heard it too. And that's when the nightmare began. We sat there in stunned silence, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on us like a heavy shroud. The night, which had once felt full of the warmth of our friendship and the lingering buzz of the party, now felt cold and menacing. No one dared to speak, each of us lost in our own thoughts, trying to make sense of the impossible. "She couldn't have just vanished," Mike finally said, his voice shaking as he broke the silence. "Maybe she's just hiding or something." "Hiding?" Lisa snapped, her voice tinged with panic. "In the middle of a cemetery? Why would she do that?" Jason, usually the bravest of us all, seemed unusually quiet. He just stared out into the darkness, his eyes narrowed as if searching for some explanation. But I knew, deep down, that there wasn't one. What we had just witnessed defied all logic, and that was what terrified me the most. "We need to leave," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. "Now." I put the car into gear and pulled away from the cemetery, my hands trembling slightly on the steering wheel. As we drove back onto the highway, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something, or someone, was following us. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the woman standing in the middle of the road, but the fog had swallowed everything behind us. The tension in the car was palpable. No one spoke, and even the usually confident Jason looked like he was trying to piece together what had just happened. The whispers we had heard were still echoing in my mind, growing louder the further we got from the cemetery. "You should never have stopped." The words played over and over, a sinister mantra that gnawed at the edges of my sanity. I didn't want to believe it, but there was no denying the sense of impending doom that had settled over us. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and I had no idea how to fix it. As we drove, the road seemed to stretch on forever, the fog growing thicker with each passing mile. I was driving slower than before, my eyes straining to see through the dense mist. The others had fallen into a tense silence, but I could feel their fear, palpable and suffocating. Then, without warning, the car's radio crackled to life. It startled all of us, the sudden burst of static shattering the eerie silence. I reached to turn it off, but before I could, a voice emerged from the white noise, faint but unmistakable. "You should never have stopped." The voice was the same as the whisper we'd heard earlier, soft, almost gentle, but laced with a cold, unrelenting malice. It sent a jolt of terror through me, and I slammed on the brakes, bringing the car to a screeching halt in the middle of the deserted road. "What the hell was that?" Mike shouted, his voice high-pitched with panic. "Turn it off!" Lisa screamed, her hands covering her ears as if trying to block out the sound. I fumbled with the radio, my fingers trembling as I tried to turn the dial, but no matter what I did, the voice kept coming through, repeating those same chilling words over and over again. "You should never have stopped." Finally, in a fit of desperation, I yanked the entire radio out of the dashboard, wires and all, and threw it onto the floor. The voice cut off abruptly, leaving behind a heavy silence that felt even more oppressive than before. We sat there, the car idling in the middle of the road, each of us too scared to move. I could hear our breathing, rapid and shallow, the only sound in the otherwise dead night. I wanted to turn the car around, to drive as fast as I could away from whatever this was, but something held me back, something I couldn't explain. "What the hell is going on?" Jason finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. No one had an answer. All we knew was that something had latched onto us, something dark and malevolent that wasn't going to let go. The woman we had picked up wasn't just a stranded traveler, she was something else, something far more sinister. "We need to keep moving," I said, though my voice lacked the confidence it usually had. I shifted the car back into drive, the tires spinning slightly on the damp asphalt as we continued down the road. But the feeling of being watched, of being followed, didn't leave us. It grew stronger, an invisible presence that seemed to cling to us, watching our every move. I could see it in the others' faces too, the same fear that was gnawing at me. We were no longer just a group of friends driving home from a party, we were being hunted. And deep down, I knew that the real nightmare had only just begun. As I drove further down the desolate road, the air in the car grew thicker with tension, and the silence was almost unbearable. Every few seconds, I glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something, or someone, looming in the darkness behind us. The fog clung to the road like a shroud, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The sense of dread that had settled over us at the cemetery refused to dissipate, growing more intense with each passing minute. The road seemed endless, as if we were caught in some kind of nightmarish loop, driving endlessly through the same stretch of misty highway. The others were silent, their eyes wide with fear as they stared out into the fog. It was as if the very air around us was alive with something malevolent, something that wanted to drag us down into the darkness. Suddenly, the car's headlights caught something moving on the side of the road. My heart leaped into my throat as I slammed on the brakes, bringing the car to a screeching halt. The others jerked forward in their seats, their gasps echoing in the confined space of the car. "What was that?" Mike asked, his voice trembling. I didn't answer. My eyes were locked on the figure that had just appeared in the beam of the headlights. It was the woman, the same woman we had picked up earlier. She stood there, her white dress glowing eerily in the light, her dark hair hanging limp around her pale face. She was staring directly at us, her eyes wide and unblinking, her lips curved into a cold, predatory smile. "Oh my God," Lisa whispered, her voice barely audible. Before I could react, the woman moved. But it wasn't a normal movement. She glided toward us, her feet never touching the ground, as if she was floating on the mist. The way she moved sent a chill down my spine, and for a moment, I was paralyzed with fear, unable to think, unable to breathe. "Drive! Drive!" Jason yelled, snapping me out of my trance. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, and the car lurched forward, the tires screeching on the wet pavement. We sped past the woman, her figure disappearing into the fog as quickly as it had appeared. My hands were shaking uncontrollably as I gripped the steering wheel, my heart pounding so hard in my chest that I thought it might burst. The road twisted and turned, the fog thickening around us, making it almost impossible to see. But I couldn't slow down, not now. I had to get us out of there, away from whatever that thing was. The others were frantic, shouting directions, their voices a cacophony of fear and panic. But then, without warning, the car jolted violently, as if we'd hit something. For a few moments, everything was a blur of pain and confusion. I could hear the others groaning, trying to shake off the shock of the crash. I blinked several times, trying to clear my head, and that's when I saw it, a shadowy figure standing just outside the car, its outline barely visible through the fogged-up windshield. "No," I whispered, my voice trembling. The figure moved closer, and as it did, I recognized it, the same woman, her face twisted into a grotesque mask of rage and hunger. She raised a hand and slammed it against the window, the glass shattering with a sharp crack. I recoiled in terror, but the others were already scrambling to get out of the car, their fear driving them into a panicked frenzy. "We have to run," Lisa screamed, pulling at the door handle until it finally gave way. We tumbled out of the car, our movements clumsy and desperate. The woman was right behind us, her presence an oppressive force that seemed to drain the air of warmth and light. I could feel her cold breath on the back of my neck as we stumbled through the fog, trying to find our way back to the road. But the fog was like a living thing, swirling around us, disorienting us, making it impossible to tell which way was which. The woman's footsteps echoed behind us, a steady, relentless sound that filled me with a cold, creeping dread. She was close, too close, and I knew that if we didn't do something soon, we would all be lost. "We need to stick together," Jason shouted, his voice strained with panic. But it was too late. The fog had swallowed Mike, his figure disappearing into the mist with a terrified scream. Lisa was crying, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she clung to Jason's arm. I could barely see them, their forms little more than shadows in the thick, suffocating fog. "This way," I shouted, trying to lead them back to the road. But as we ran, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent than before. They filled my mind, drowning out all other thoughts, pulling me into a darkness that I couldn't escape. "You should never have stopped." I stumbled, the weight of the words crushing down on me, but Jason grabbed my arm, pulling me forward. "Don't listen to it," he yelled, his voice cutting through the fog. "We're getting out of this." I wanted to believe him, but the woman was closing in, her shadow looming over us, her eyes burning with an unholy light. I could feel her cold fingers brushing against my skin, and I knew that we were running out of time. Then, just as all hope seemed lost, the fog began to lift, revealing the road ahead. The sight of it filled me with a sudden surge of hope, and I pushed myself harder, dragging Lisa and Jason along with me. "We're almost there," I shouted, but my voice was drowned out by the woman's wail, a bone-chilling scream that pierced the night, filling me with a terror unlike anything I'd ever felt. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. The road was just a few steps away, and I knew that if we could just reach it, we might have a chance. We burst out of the fog, our feet hitting the asphalt with a thud. The headlights of a distant car appeared in the distance, a small beacon of hope in the overwhelming darkness. I waved my arms frantically, trying to get the driver's attention, praying that they would stop and help us. But before the car could reach us, the woman's scream echoed once more, and I knew that the nightmare wasn't over yet. The car approached, its headlights cutting through the darkness like a knife. I waved my arms more frantically, desperate to get the driver's attention, but the woman's wail echoed louder in my ears, drowning out every other sound. The air around us seemed to thicken, as if the very night itself was conspiring to pull us back into the fog. The car screeched to a halt just a few feet away, and the driver, a middle-aged man with a look of confusion and concern on his face, leaned out of the window. "Are you kids all right?" he called out, his voice tinged with worry. "Please, help us," Lisa screamed, her voice trembling with fear. Before the man could respond, the fog swirled violently behind us, and the woman emerged from the mist, her eyes glowing with an eerie, malevolent light. She was closer now, her cold, bony fingers reaching out toward us, her expression twisted into a mask of fury and hunger. The driver's eyes widened in horror as he took in the sight of the ghostly figure. "What the hell is that?" he muttered, but he didn't wait for an answer. Instead, he threw open the car door. "Get in, now!" We didn't need to be told twice. Lisa, Jason, and I scrambled into the car, slamming the door shut behind us. The driver hit the gas pedal, and the car roared forward, the tires squealing as they struggled for traction on the wet road. For a moment, I thought we had escaped, but then I saw her. She was keeping pace with the car, gliding alongside us as if the laws of physics meant nothing to her. "She's not stopping," Jason yelled, his voice filled with panic. "Just drive faster," I shouted at the driver, my heart pounding in my chest. "I'm going as fast as I can," the driver snapped back, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. The woman's face appeared at the window, her eyes boring into mine. I felt a cold dread wash over me, as if her gaze was draining the very life from my body. Her lips moved, but I couldn't hear what she was saying over the roar of the engine and the pounding of my own heart. But then, just as I thought she would break through the glass and drag us all to our doom, the car hit a sharp curve in the road, and the woman's figure wavered, her form becoming less solid, less real. The headlights of the car illuminated a large, imposing structure up ahead, a church, its steeple piercing the sky like a beacon of hope. "Head for the church," Lisa shouted, her voice tinged with desperation. The driver didn't hesitate. He swerved onto the narrow dirt road leading up to the church, the tires kicking up gravel as we raced toward the sanctuary. The woman's wail echoed in the distance, but it was growing fainter, as if the closer we got to the church, the weaker she became. Finally, the car screeched to a halt in front of the church, and we tumbled out, our legs shaking with exhaustion and fear. The church doors stood open, a warm, welcoming light spilling out onto the steps. We didn't need to speak, we just ran, our feet pounding against the stone steps as we raced toward the entrance. As we crossed the threshold, I felt a strange sensation wash over me, a feeling of safety, of peace. The air inside the church was warm and still, a stark contrast to the cold, malevolent presence we had just escaped. I turned to look behind us, expecting to see the woman right on our heels, but she was gone. The fog had dissipated, and the night outside was clear and calm. "We made it," Jason whispered, his voice filled with relief. But I wasn't so sure. Something didn't feel right. The church was empty, too empty. There were no candles lit, no signs of recent activity. It was as if the building had been abandoned for years. A chill ran down my spine as I realized that the sense of safety I had felt moments before was an illusion, a trick to lure us inside. "Guys," I said, my voice trembling. "We need to leave. Now." But before we could move, the church doors slammed shut behind us, trapping us inside. The warm light flickered, then vanished, plunging the church into darkness. I heard Lisa gasp, and Jason mutter a curse under his breath. Then, from the shadows at the far end of the church, I saw movement. A figure stepped forward, shrouded in darkness, but I knew without a doubt that it was her. The woman from the road. The Nueva de Estrada. "You should never have stopped," she whispered, her voice echoing through the empty church. The air grew cold, and the darkness seemed to press in on us from all sides. I could feel her presence, feel the weight of her anger and pain. She was closer now, her face twisted with rage, her eyes burning with an unholy light. There was no escape. But then, from behind us, I heard the sound of a door creaking open. I turned, my heart leaping with hope. An old man, dressed in priestly robes, stood in the doorway, a look of grim determination on his face. He held a silver cross in one hand and a vial of holy water in the other. "Back, demon," the priest commanded, his voice strong and unwavering. The woman hissed, recoiling from the sight of the cross. The air around her shimmered, and for a moment, her form seemed to waver, as if she was struggling to maintain her hold on this world. "Go back to where you came from," the priest shouted, throwing the holy water in her direction. The water sizzled as it made contact with her skin, and she let out a scream that shook the very foundations of the church. Her form flickered, and then, with one final, soul-piercing wail, she vanished, leaving nothing but silence in her wake. For a moment, none of us moved, too stunned to process what had just happened. Then, slowly, the lights flickered back on, bathing the church in a warm, golden glow. The priest lowered the cross, his expression weary but relieved. "It's over," he said softly. "You're safe now." We collapsed onto the nearest pews, our bodies trembling with exhaustion and relief. The nightmare was finally over. The Nueva de Estrada was gone, and we were safe. But as I sat there, trying to calm my racing heart, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong, that the danger hadn't truly passed. I didn't know why, but deep down, I knew that this wasn't the end. And then, I heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, coming from the shadows. "You should never have stopped." The whisper lingered in the air, sending a chill down my spine. I looked around the church, my eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement, but everything seemed still, almost too still. The priest, sensing my unease, placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "It's all right, son," he said, his voice steady. "The spirit has been banished. You're safe now." But I wasn't convinced. The fear gnawing at the edge of my mind wouldn't fade. I exchanged a glance with Lisa and Jason. They were both pale, their eyes wide with the same lingering dread. "We need to leave," I said, standing up. "Now." The priest nodded. "I'll walk you to your car." We exited the church together, the night air cool and fresh against my skin. The oppressive fog had lifted entirely, revealing a sky dotted with stars. The landscape around us was peaceful, the kind of serenity that only the deepest part of the night could offer. But it felt like a fragile peace, one that could shatter at any moment. As we approached the car, something caught my eye, a faint outline in the dirt road, barely visible under the dim light of the moon. Footprints. Small, delicate, like those of a woman. They led away from the car, back toward the cemetery we had passed earlier. "Do you see that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Lisa followed my gaze and gasped. "Oh my God, she's still here." The priest stepped forward, his expression grim. "The spirit was drawn to you for a reason. You must have crossed her path in a way that awakened her." "Awakened her?" Jason echoed, his voice shaking. "But she's gone, right? You banished her." "I did," the priest replied, his voice somber. "But spirits like hers are bound by the pain and tragedy of their past. They linger, waiting for someone to cross their path so they can relive their torment. The ritual I performed should have sent her back, but it seems she's not ready to rest." "What does that mean for us?" Lisa asked, fear lacing her words. The priest sighed. "You need to make amends, offer closure. Sometimes, the only way to truly put a spirit to rest is to confront the source of their pain. The thought of facing the Nueva de Estrada again made my blood run cold, but I knew we couldn't leave things as they were. If we didn't confront her now, she would haunt us forever, a shadow at the edge of our lives, waiting to strike. We need to go back, I said, the realization settling heavily in my chest. Back to the cemetery? Jason asked, his voice full of dread. Yes, the priest confirmed. You have to confront her there. It's where her story began, and where it must end. We piled into the car, the priest taking the driver's seat this time. The drive to the cemetery was short, but it felt like an eternity. My heart pounded in my chest, the tension thickening with every passing second. The moonlight bathed the graveyard in an eerie glow as we pulled up to the gates. The moment we stepped out of the car, the temperature dropped, the air turning frigid. The atmosphere was heavy, oppressive, as if the very ground beneath us was holding its breath. We walked through the cemetery, the priest leading the way, his cross held high. We came to a stop at a crumbling tombstone near the edge of the graveyard. It was old, the inscription barely legible, but I could just make out the name carved into the stone, Ana Maria, beloved wife, lost too soon. This is her, the priest said quietly. This is where she was laid to rest. We stood there in silence, the weight of her story pressing down on us. I could almost see her, a young bride full of hope, her life tragically cut short. And then I heard it again, the whisper, but this time it was different. It wasn't angry or vengeful. It was sad. I didn't mean to hurt anyone, the voice said, and I realized it was coming from inside my head, as if she was speaking directly to me. I just wanted to go home. The fog began to swirl around the grave, thickening into a dense mist. Out of it, she appeared, her form shimmering in the moonlight. But she was different now, less menacing, more ethereal. Her eyes, once filled with anger, now glistened with tears. "Why did you leave me?" she whispered, her voice broken with grief. I stepped forward, feeling an overwhelming sense of sorrow. "We didn't mean to," I said softly. "We didn't know." The priest stepped beside me, holding out his cross. "Ana Maria," he said gently, "your time here has ended. You don't have to suffer anymore. It's time to rest." She looked at him, her expression softening, and then back at me. "Can I go home now?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Yes," I replied, my voice catching in my throat. "You can go home." She smiled, a sad, wistful smile, and then her form began to fade, dissolving into the mist. The fog lifted, and the night was clear again, the tension in the air gone. The Nueva de Estrada had finally found peace. We stood there for a moment, the silence of the cemetery now comforting rather than eerie. The priest nodded to us, a small smile on his lips. "It's over," he said. "She's at peace now." We made our way back to the car, the weight on our shoulders lifted, the fear that had gripped our hearts finally released. As we drove away from the cemetery, the first light of dawn began to break on the horizon, a new day rising from the shadows of the night. For the first time since that harrowing night began, I felt truly safe, knowing that the spirit of Ana Maria had found her way home, and we had made it through the terror that had threatened to consume us. As we left the cemetery behind, I couldn't help but glance back one last time. The graveyard was quiet, peaceful, the final resting place of a soul that had been lost for so long. We had survived the night, and I knew, deep down, that she would never haunt us again. The Nueva de Estrada was finally at peace, and so were we. The Snowman. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, a break from the mundane routine of school and the relentless pressures of life. We had planned it for weeks, anticipating the freedom that a weekend in the mountains would bring. Just the five of us, surrounded by nothing but snow-covered trees, the crisp winter air, and the promise of a good time. The cabin we rented was nestled deep in the woods, far from the nearest town. It was exactly what we were looking for: isolated, quiet, and perfect for a weekend of relaxation. We had brought enough food, drinks, and games to keep us entertained for days. But when a snowstorm hit, it came out of nowhere, much stronger than any of us had expected. By the time the storm settled, the world outside had transformed into a white, frozen wasteland. Snow piled high against the windows, and the roads were completely buried. We were stuck, but none of us seemed to mind. In fact, being snowed in only added to the thrill of our little adventure. "Let's build a snowman," Kevin suggested, his eyes gleaming with excitement. He was always the one to bring the energy, the one who could turn a dull moment into something fun. "Are you serious?" I asked, looking out at the mountains of snow through the foggy window. "We can barely see anything out there." "Come on, Jack," Kevin said, clapping me on the back. "What else are we going to do? Play Monopoly all weekend?" He had a point. We were already getting cabin fever, and it was only our first night. Building a snowman seemed as good an idea as any. We bundled up in our thick winter coats, scarves, and gloves, and headed outside. The cold was biting, the kind of cold that made your breath freeze in the air and your fingers go numb within seconds. But it didn't deter us. We were determined to make the biggest snowman we could. "Let's make it huge," Sarah suggested, her cheeks flushed red from the cold. "Like, really big. Bigger than any snowman we've ever made." And so we did. We spent hours rolling massive snowballs, stacking them on top of each other until the snowman towered over us. It was a monster of a snowman, easily over 7 feet tall. We used twigs for arms, stones for buttons, and an old scarf we found in the cabin to wrap around its neck. Kevin even found an old top hat in the attic to complete the look. "There," he said, stepping back to admire our work. "The biggest snowman ever." It was impressive, standing tall against the darkening sky. But there was something unsettling about it, too. The way the shadows played across its face, making it look almost alive. "You know," Sarah said as we finished, "there's a legend around here about a snowman." "Oh great," I said, rolling my eyes. "Here we go." "No, seriously," she insisted. "They say there's a snowman that comes to life during big storms like this. It hunts people down, one by one." "Yeah, right," Kevin laughed. "And Santa Claus is real, too." "I'm not kidding," Sarah said, her tone serious. "It's an old legend. People around here call it the cursed snowman. They say it was created by a witch who wanted revenge on a town that wronged her. She cursed the snowman to come to life during storms, to kill anyone who crossed its path. That's just a story," Emily, our more skeptical friend, said, shaking her head. "A way to scare kids into behaving." "Maybe," Sarah said, but the look in her eyes told me she believed it, at least a little bit. As the night fell, we headed back inside, leaving the snowman to stand guard over the cabin. We settled in for the night, the warmth of the fire and the laughter of friends washing away any lingering unease. But as I lay in bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I heard a noise outside, a faint crunching sound, like footsteps in the snow. I told myself it was just my imagination, that it was probably just the wind. But when I got up to look out the window, I could have sworn I saw the snowman standing closer to the cabin than before. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. Snowmen don't move. They can't. It's impossible. But deep down, I couldn't help but wonder, what if Sarah's story was true? What if we had just awakened something that should have been left alone? I went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The image of the snowman, looming in the darkness, haunted my thoughts, and the sound of those footsteps echoed in my mind. I told myself it was all just a story, that we were safe. But a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that we had crossed a line without realizing it, and that we were no longer alone in these woods. The next morning, the cabin was eerily quiet. The kind of quiet that feels almost unnatural, as if the very air itself was holding its breath. I woke up early, long before the others, and lay there in bed, staring at the ceiling. The events of the previous night replayed in my mind: the snowman, the strange noises, the uneasy feeling that had settled deep in my gut. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just the remnants of a bad dream. But something gnawed at me, a nagging sense that something was off. I finally decided to get up and check on things outside, just to put my mind at ease. The cold hit me like a wall as I stepped outside, the sharp winter air biting into my skin. The snow had piled even higher overnight, but the storm had passed, leaving the world blanketed in a thick, white silence. I trudged through the snow to where we had built the snowman, my boots crunching with every step. When I reached the spot, I stopped dead in my tracks. The snowman was gone. My heart skipped a beat. At first, I thought maybe the wind had knocked it over or that the snow had collapsed under its own weight. But there were no signs of it anywhere. No scattered pieces, no broken snowballs. Just an empty patch of snow where it had stood the night before. I stood there, dumbfounded, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, or rather, what I wasn't seeing. My mind raced through possibilities, but none of them made any sense. Snowmen don't just vanish into thin air. Jack? Emily's voice called from behind me, startling me out of my thoughts. I turned to see her standing at the cabin door, rubbing her arms to keep warm. "What are you doing out here?" "The snowman," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's gone." "What?" She frowned, stepping closer to see for herself. "That's impossible." "I know," I said, still staring at the empty spot. "But it's true. It's just gone." Emily stared at the spot where the snowman had been, her brow furrowed in confusion. "Maybe Kevin and the others took it down as a joke?" "Maybe," I said, though I didn't believe it for a second. Kevin was a prankster, sure, but this didn't feel like a prank. It felt wrong. The others woke up soon after, and we gathered in the living room to discuss what had happened. Kevin insisted he hadn't touched the snowman, and neither had Sarah or Emily. None of us could explain it. "It's probably just the wind," Kevin said, trying to sound confident, though there was a nervous edge to his voice. "Or maybe the snow just collapsed." But as the day wore on, the tension in the cabin grew. Every little noise, every creak of the wood or gust of wind seemed amplified, putting us all on edge. We couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, lurking just beyond our sight. That night, we huddled around the fireplace, trying to distract ourselves with stories and games, but the mood had shifted. The laughter was forced, and the smiles didn't reach our eyes. The unease was palpable, like a shadow hanging over us. "Maybe we should leave," Sarah suggested, breaking the silence that had settled over us. "Just in case." "Leave?" Kevin scoffed, though his voice wavered. "And go where?" "The roads are still buried, and we're miles from town." "We could hike out," Emily said, though she didn't sound convinced. "We're not going anywhere," Kevin insisted. "It's just a snowman. There's nothing to be scared of." But despite his words, I could see the fear in his eyes. We all felt it. The cabin, once a cozy retreat, now felt like a prison. And the snowman, whatever had happened to it, was a constant, looming presence in our minds. We tried to sleep that night, but sleep didn't come easily. Every sound, every shift in the shadows, kept us awake, our nerves on edge. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to tell myself it was all just in our heads. But deep down, I knew better. Something was out there. Something that shouldn't exist. And it was only a matter of time before it made its presence known. As the hours dragged on, I finally drifted into a fitful sleep, haunted by dreams of cold, lifeless eyes watching me from the darkness. I woke with a start sometime in the middle of the night. The cabin was pitch black, the only sound the faint crackle of the dying fire. I sat up, my heart racing, my breath coming in shallow gasps. And that's when I heard it. The faintest sound, almost imperceptible, a soft, crunching noise, like footsteps in the snow, moving closer and closer to the cabin. I held my breath, straining to listen, but the sound was gone as quickly as it had come. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it, but there was only one thought that filled my mind. The snowman wasn't gone. It was out there, and it was coming for us. The following morning, the tension in the cabin had grown thicker, almost suffocating. None of us had slept well, and the dark circles under our eyes told the story of a restless night filled with fear and uncertainty. The snow outside was still deep, glistening under the weak winter sun, but the warmth it once held was gone. Now, it seemed more like a shroud, covering something sinister. As we gathered in the kitchen for a silent breakfast, Emily was the first to break the uneasy quiet. "Did anyone else hear something last night?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I looked around at the others. Kevin shook his head, but his eyes were downcast, avoiding our gazes. Sarah's face was pale, and she seemed reluctant to speak. I knew then that I wasn't the only one who had heard the crunching footsteps in the snow. I heard it, I admitted, my voice shaky. Footsteps outside the cabin. Kevin finally looked up, his expression one of disbelief mixed with fear. "You're saying the snowman is alive?" "I don't know what I'm saying," I replied, frustration bubbling up inside me. "But something's out there, and it's not just the wind." "We should leave," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "We need to get out of here before it's too late." "But how?" Emily asked, her eyes wide with fear. "The roads are still buried, and hiking out in this snowstorm could be just as dangerous." "Maybe there's another way," I suggested, trying to think clearly despite the rising panic. "We could try to contact someone, or maybe there's something we can do to stop this thing." "Like what?" Kevin snapped, his usual bravado crumbling. "It's a freaking snowman. What are we supposed to do, melt it with a hairdryer?" His sarcasm hung in the air, but there was no humor in it. We were all scared, and the absurdity of the situation was too much to process. But I wasn't ready to give up just yet. "There has to be something," I said, more to myself than to the others. "Some way to stop it." Emily glanced out the window, her eyes narrowing as she spotted something in the distance. "Guys, look." We all turned to follow her gaze, and what we saw sent chills down my spine. There, just beyond the edge of the forest, was the snowman. It was standing perfectly still, its lifeless eyes fixed on the cabin. "It moved," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "It was farther away before." "Okay, this is insane," Kevin said, backing away from the window. "We need to figure out what the hell is going on." I racked my brain, trying to recall the details of the legend we had heard the day before. The story was vague, but there had to be something in it that could help us. "The legend," I said, trying to piece it together. It said the snowman comes to life during a storm and hunts those who build it, right? But there must be a way to stop it. Sarah, who had been silently listening, suddenly spoke up. I remember something about fire, she said, her eyes widening as she recalled the details. They said fire was the only thing that could destroy it. That's why people used to burn their snowmen after a storm. Burn it? Kevin repeated, his fear giving way to determination. That's it? We just need to set it on fire? It's worth a shot, I said, feeling a spark of hope. But we need to lure it closer. We can't exactly light it up from here. Emily nodded, her face set with resolve. I'll get the firewood, she said, already moving toward the fireplace. We'll need accelerants too, I added, thinking quickly. Anything flammable, gasoline, lighter fluid, whatever we can find. The plan was simple, but it was the best we had. As Emily gathered the wood and Sarah searched for any flammable liquids we could use, Kevin and I kept watch at the windows, our eyes locked on the snowman. It hadn't moved, but its presence was unnerving. It felt like it was waiting, biding its time. The sun was sinking lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the snow. We didn't have much time. Finally, we were ready. The firewood was stacked in the center of the yard, doused with lighter fluid and ready to be lit. All we needed was to lure the snowman into the trap. How do we get it to move? Kevin asked, glancing nervously between me and the snowman. I thought for a moment, then grabbed the shovel we had used to build the snowman in the first place. I'll go out there, I said, steeling myself. If it follows me, you light the fire. Are you crazy? Emily exclaimed, grabbing my arm. You can't go out there alone. I have to, I said, meeting her worried gaze. If we don't stop it now, it's just going to keep coming for us. Reluctantly, she let go of my arm, and I took a deep breath, preparing myself for what was to come. I stepped outside into the cold, the shovel gripped tightly in my hands. The snow crunched underfoot as I approached the snowman, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, I stood there, facing the monstrous creation we had unwittingly brought to life. Its eyes seemed to follow me, dark and empty, yet filled with an inexplicable malice. Come on, I muttered, taking a step back. Come and get me. I swung the shovel at the snowman's body, striking it hard. The sound echoed in the stillness, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sudden, unnatural lurch, the snowman began to move. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I turned and bolted back toward the cabin, the snowman's heavy footsteps thudding behind me. The others were waiting, the fire ready to be lit. Now, I shouted as I reached the firewood pile, barely managing to skid to a stop. Kevin struck a match and threw it onto the wood, igniting it in a burst of flames. The fire roared to life, casting a warm glow against the encroaching darkness. The snowman halted, just inches from the flames. For a moment, it seemed to waver, as if unsure of what to do next. Then, with a final, bone-chilling scream, it lunged into the fire. We all jumped back as the flames engulfed it, the heat intensed against our faces. The snowman writhed and twisted, its form melting away into nothingness. In moments, it was gone, reduced to a puddle of water and charred remains. We stood there in stunned silence, hardly daring to believe it was over. The snow around us was beginning to melt, and the oppressive sense of dread that had filled the air was finally lifting. It's gone, Sarah whispered, her voice trembling with relief. Yeah, I said, my voice hoarse. We did it. But even as I said the words, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had only just escaped with our lives. The legend of the cursed snowman might have been put to rest, but the memory of it would haunt us forever. As the flames died down, the heavy atmosphere that had oppressed us since the storm began finally started to lift. The fire had done its job, reducing the cursed snowman to nothing more than a steaming puddle of water and charred twigs. We stood in silence, the crackling of the dying fire the only sound in the cold, still air. For a long moment, none of us spoke. It was as if we were all afraid to break the fragile peace that had finally settled over the cabin. The terror of the last few days still clung to us, a reminder of how close we had come to a horrifying end. "I think it's really over," Emily finally said, her voice soft and filled with cautious hope. "Yeah," I replied, though a part of me still felt uneasy. "I think so too." The others nodded, their faces reflecting the exhaustion and relief that I was feeling. It was hard to believe that just hours ago, we had been fighting for our lives against a creature of legend, something that should never have existed. But it had existed, and we had destroyed it. "We should pack up and get out of here," Kevin said, his voice steady for the first time in what felt like days. "The storm's let up, and we don't need to stick around any longer than we have to." No one argued. We all knew it was time to leave this place behind. The snow was beginning to melt, and the roads would soon be passable again. We gathered our things quickly, the urgency to leave growing stronger with each passing minute. As we loaded our bags into the car, I took one last look at the spot where the snowman had stood. The fire had left nothing behind but a patch of blackened earth, a stark contrast to the white snow that surrounded it. It was hard to believe that something so terrifying had once stood there, something we had created with our own hands. But it was over now. The nightmare was behind us, and it was time to move on. We piled into the car, the warmth of the heater a welcome relief from the cold. The engine roared to life, and as we pulled away from the cabin, I couldn't help but glance back one last time. The cabin looked small and insignificant in the rearview mirror, a fading memory of a place where we had faced our fears and come out alive. The snow was still thick on the ground, but the sun was starting to break through the clouds, casting long shadows across the landscape. We drove in silence for a while, each of us lost in our thoughts. The road stretched out before us, winding through the snow-covered trees, leading us back to the world we had left behind. As the miles passed, the tension in the car began to ease. We were safe. The snowman was gone, and the legend that had haunted this place would trouble us no more. "Do you think anyone will believe us?" Sarah asked, breaking the silence. I shook my head, a small smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. "Probably not," I admitted. "But that's okay. We know what happened, and that's all that matters." Emily nodded in agreement. "Yeah, it's not like we need to tell anyone. Some things are better left unsaid." Kevin chuckled, a sound that was more relief than humor. "Besides, who would believe a story about a killer snowman anyway?" We all laughed, the sound lifting the last of the lingering fear from our hearts. It felt good to laugh again, to let go of the terror that had held us in its grip. The drive back to town was uneventful, and by the time we reached the city limits, the snow had turned to slush, melting away under the warmth of the sun. The nightmare of the snowman seemed distant now, like something from a bad dream. We dropped Kevin and Emily off first, then Sarah. Each of us exchanged quiet goodbyes, promising to keep in touch and maybe, one day, laugh about the whole thing. As I finally pulled into my driveway, I felt a wave of exhaustion wash over me. I was home. It was over. I grabbed my bag and headed inside, the warmth of my house enveloping me like a comforting embrace. I dropped my things by the door and made my way to the kitchen, desperate for a hot cup of coffee. As the coffee brewed, I glanced out the window at the backyard. The snow was nearly gone, reduced to a few patches of white here and there. It was hard to believe that just a day ago, we had been trapped in a cabin, fighting for our lives against a monstrous snowman. The coffee finished brewing, and I poured myself a cup, savoring the warmth as I sipped it slowly. I let out a long breath, feeling the last of the tension leave my body. But as I stood there, staring out at the melting snow, something caught my eye. My heart skipped a beat as I noticed a small, white figure in the corner of the yard, half hidden behind the bushes. It was a snowman. A small, simple snowman, no bigger than a child's toy. Its button eyes stared back at me, unblinking. For a moment, I couldn't move. The mug slipped from my fingers, shattering on the floor as I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. Then, just as suddenly, I let out a nervous laugh. It was just a snowman. A harmless, ordinary snowman. Probably made by the neighborhood kids. Nothing to be afraid of. But as I turned away from the window, I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, the legend wasn't completely over. And somewhere out there in the melting snow, something was watching and waiting.
If you want to watch another story, there is another video appearing on your screen now. Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more spine-chilling stories.